In 1928, a farmer near the Syrian coastline was turning over his field when the plow hit something solid underground. It was not a stone. It had struck the roof of a burial chamber. That accident would guide archaeologists toward one of the most important discoveries in the study of religion. Beneath a mound known as Ras Shamra lay the remains of a city that had vanished for more than 3,000 years, a city that contained a library. Not a library filled with scrolls or books as we might imagine today, but one made of clay tablets. Thousands of them, marked with an unfamiliar wedge-shaped writing that no one could immediately decipher. And inside those tablets was something remarkable. Stories of gods struggling for power in the heavens, a storm god fighting the sea, a god of death swallowing his rival whole, a council of divine beings debating, plotting, and warring above the clouds while the people below remained unaware. And here is the question that will guide us tonight. Centuries after those tablets were created, another body of texts appeared, describing a different heavenly conflict. Fallen angels known as the Watchers, beings who left their proper place in the divine order, crossed into the human world, and released corruption across the earth. Their story appears in the Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish work that never became part of most Bibles, yet still shaped religious imagination for centuries. So, could there be a connection? Could the battles among Canaanite gods, recorded on clay tablets many centuries before Enoch was written, represent an earlier echo of the same cosmic theme? Fallen powers, divine rebellion, a heavenly order disturbed from within. But we need to be careful here. It is tempting to draw a straight line between two ancient traditions and call them the same myth in different forms. That is not what the evidence shows, and it is not what serious scholars argue. Ugarit and Enoch are divided by centuries, by different languages, different religious systems, and entirely different purposes. One belongs to Bronze Age Canaanite mythology, preserved by a royal scribal school. The other is a Jewish apocalyptic text, written under completely different historical pressures. They're not the same tradition, but they might be related the way a grandmother and a great-granddaughter are related. Not identical, but carrying something recognizable across the generations. Shared cosmic geography, shared assumptions about divine hierarchies, shared anxieties about what happens when the boundary between heaven and earth gets crossed. Tonight, we're going to move through this slowly. We'll start with the discovery itself, the mound, the tablets, the language nobody could read until they could. Then we'll walk carefully through the mythology itself. The gods, the battles, the palace on the mountain, the death and the mourning, and the eventual return. After that, we'll turn to Enoch and ask what, if anything, connects these two visions of divine conflict separated by so much time and so much history. There's no rush here. This is the kind of story that rewards patience, the kind you can let wash over you slowly as the night goes on. Before we go further, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right there for you. I genuinely love reading through the comments in the morning, someone in Lisbon at midnight, someone in Manila at sunrise, all listening to the same story at completely different moments. It's a small thing, but it makes this feel like something shared rather than something solitary. And if you're enjoying these long, slow journeys through history, the best way to support what we're doing here is to follow the show on Spotify. Listen there when you can, and if you're willing, leave a 5-star review. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and the link is right there in the description whenever you're ready. Now, let's go back to that mound in Syria and the moment a farmer's plow uncovered a lost civilization. Let's slow down and actually sit inside that moment for a second, because the discovery itself deserves more than a passing mention. It's 1928, on the northern coast of Syria, near a small bay called Minet el Beda, the White Harbor. A local farmer is working his land the way farmers in that region had worked it for generations, plowing furrows into soil that had been plowed 1,000 times before. And then his plow catches on something. Not a stone, not a root, something with edges too regular to be natural. He digs down and finds himself looking at the roof of a tomb. An old one built from carefully fitted stone, in a style nobody in that farming village had ever used. Word travels fast in small communities, And it wasn't long before French archaeologists who were already working in the region under a colonial mandate heard about the strange tomb near the coast and came to take a look. What they found at first seemed modest enough: a burial chamber, some artifacts, the kind of thing that gets logged, catalogued, and quietly filed away in a museum basement. But archaeologists have a habit of asking one more question than they need to. And that habit paid off here in a spectacular way, because just a short distance inland from that tomb sat an enormous mound, a tell, as archaeologists call it, a hill built up over centuries by the collapsed and rebuilt layers of human settlement, stacked on top of each other like the pages of a book nobody had opened in 3,000 years. The mound was called Ras Shamra, which means something like Fennel Hill in Arabic, named for the wild fennel plants that grew across its slopes. Nobody suspected that beneath those fennel plants was an entire lost city, one of the most important cities of the ancient Mediterranean world, sitting there quietly, waiting. Excavation began the following year in 1929, led by a French archaeologist named Claude Schaeffer, and almost immediately, the team realized they weren't dealing with some minor regional settlement. They were uncovering the remains of a genuine Bronze Age metropolis, layered with the ruins of a royal palace, multiple temples, private houses belonging to wealthy merchants and scribes, workshops, storage facilities, streets laid out with real urban planning. This was not a village. This was a city that had once mattered, a city with money, with power, with connections stretching in every direction across the ancient world. And that's exactly what the archaeological evidence started to show as digging continued. Ugarit, as the city turned out to be called, once its own inhabitants' writings could finally be read, sat at an extraordinarily convenient location on the Mediterranean coast. It had a natural harbor, protected waters, easy access to shipping lanes that connected it to nearly every major power of the Late Bronze Age. Egyptian goods showed up in its ruins. So did Hittite artifacts from Anatolia in what's now Turkey. Mesopotamian influence was everywhere in its religious texts and administrative practices. Cryate pottery turned up by the crate load. Evidence of a thriving trade relationship across the water. Ugarit wasn't isolated. It was a hub, a crossroads city where merchants, diplomats, and travelers from radically different civilizations crossed paths, did business, and probably argued over exchange rates in at least 4 different languages. Think about what that actually means for a city in the 2nd millennium before our era. This wasn't some backwater. This was a place wealthy enough, connected enough, and important enough that the great powers of the ancient world all had reason to deal with it directly. Egyptian pharaohs corresponded with its kings. Hittite emperors considered it valuable enough to fight over politically, if not always militarily. Ugarit sat right at the intersection of the era's major civilizations, absorbing influence from all of them, while still maintaining its own distinct culture, its own gods, its own stories about how the world worked. And as Schaeffer's team kept digging, they uncovered the physical structure of that culture in remarkable detail. There was a royal palace, a genuinely impressive one, with dozens of rooms, courtyards, and storage areas, clearly the seat of a ruling dynasty with real administrative reach. There were temples, including ones dedicated to the storm god Baal and to the high god El, structures built with the kind of investment that tells you religion here wasn't a private hobby. It was civic infrastructure, deeply woven into the identity and function of the city itself, and scattered throughout the site in the palace, in the temples, and remarkably in the private homes of individual families. Archaeologists kept finding tablets, thousands of them eventually, clay tablets covered in a wedge-shaped script, pressed into wet clay with a stylus, and then baked or dried until the words were essentially locked in place forever. This is really the detail that separates Ugarit from so many other archaeological sites. It's one thing to find a beautiful palace or an impressive temple. Ancient civilizations left behind plenty of both. But finding a written archive, an actual library's worth of texts describing not just administrative records and trade agreements, but religious mythology, ritual instructions, poetry, and stories about the gods themselves. That's genuinely rare. Most ancient religious traditions come down to us second-hand, filtered through later writers, translated and reinterpreted by cultures that didn't necessarily share the original beliefs. Ugarit gave archaeologists something closer to a direct transmission. Words written by people who actually worship these gods, describing their mythology in their own language, preserved not through oral tradition passed down for centuries, but through physical clay tablets that had simply been sitting in the ground since the city fell. And that raises an obvious question. Why were they still there? Why hadn't these tablets been lost, scattered, destroyed, or carried off the way so much ancient writing eventually was? The answer, as unsettling as it sounds, is that Ugarit's destruction is exactly what saved it, sometime around 1,200 years before our era. In the final chaotic decades of the late Bronze Age, Ugarit was destroyed. This was a period of tremendous upheaval across the entire Eastern Mediterranean world, a time when major civilizations that had stood for centuries suddenly collapsed in the span of just a few generations. Historians still debate exactly what caused it. Invading groups, sometimes called the Sea Peoples, get blamed in some ancient records. Climate shifts, earthquakes, famine, and internal political collapse likely all played a role as well. Whatever the precise combination of causes, Ugarit was burned, and it was never rebuilt. Its people scattered or died, its palace and temples collapsed into rubble, and its archives, instead of being carefully preserved or copied for future generations, were simply buried under the debris of the city's own destruction. That destruction sealed everything in place. The tablets weren't damaged by fire so much as they were essentially baked further by it, hardening the clay and helping preserve the writing rather than destroying it. And then centuries of soil, dust, and collapsed mud bricks settled over the ruins, protecting them from erosion, from lutters, from the simple wear of time, until a farmer's plow struck a tomb roof in 1928 and set off a chain of discovery nobody could have predicted. So Ugarit sits at a very particular moment in history, the final flourishing century of the late Bronze Age, a wealthy cosmopolitan port city deeply connected to Egypt, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and Cyprus, right before the entire system that supported cities like it came crashing down. And buried in its ruins, waiting patiently for over 3,000 years, was a script nobody could read yet, describing gods nobody remembered anymore. That's where our story picks up next, because before anyone could understand what these tablets were actually saying, someone first had to figure out how to read them at all. The first thing scholars noticed was that the writing looked familiar and completely wrong. It was uniform, or at least it appeared to be. The signs were made from wedges pressed into clay with a reed stylus, just like the writing systems of Mesopotamia. For more than 2,000 years, scribes in cities like Babylon, Ashur, and Nineveh had used wedges to record everything from temple offerings to royal victories to stories about gods and floods and kings who refused to die. So when the tablets from Ugarit came out of the ground covered in neat rows of tiny wedge marks, archaeologists had a reasonable first guess. They assumed this was another form of the great Mesopotamian scribal tradition. But then they started counting. Mesopotamian cuneiform was not an alphabet. It was a huge and complicated system built from signs that could represent whole words, syllables, ideas, or sometimes several different sounds depending on context. A skilled Babylonian scribe had to master hundreds of signs, along with a frightening number of alternate readings. One sign might mean a word in Sumerian, a syllable in Akkadian, and something else entirely when placed beside another sign. It was powerful, flexible, ancient, and not especially forgiving to beginners. The Ugaritic tablets did not work like that. Instead of hundreds of signs, the unfamiliar script seemed to have only around 30 signs. That is the kind of number that makes a decipherer sit up straight. It suggested not a system of words and syllables, but something much simpler, and in its own way, much more revolutionary. An alphabet. Imagine the surprise. Here were clay tablets written with the visual technology of Mesopotamia. Those old wedge-shaped marks that seemed to belong to palace archives and temple schools on the Euphrates. But underneath that familiar appearance was an alphabetic script. The scribes of Ugarit had taken the physical method of cuneiform writing and used it for a very different kind of system. They were not writing hundreds of syllables, they were using individual signs to represent the basic sounds of their language. It is a little like finding a modern message carved in Roman numerals, only to realize it is actually written with the logic of a keyboard. The surface tells you one story. The structure underneath tells you another. And once scholars understood that they were looking at an alphabet, the tablets began to give up their secrets. The language written in this script is now called Ugaritic, named after the city where it was found. Ugaritic was a northwest Semitic language, part of the same broad language family as Hebrew, Phoenician, Aramaic, and later Arabic, in a more distant sense. It was not Hebrew, it was not Phoenician, but it was related closely enough that words, names, and grammatical patterns began to look familiar to scholars who knew the languages of the ancient Levant. A word for king looked like a word for king in Hebrew. A word for house resembled the Hebrew word for house. Divine names appeared in forms that later readers of the Hebrew Bible would recognize immediately. El Baal Anyamot. At first these were just shapes in clay. Then they became sounds, then words, then fragments of sentences, and eventually entire worlds. The decipherment did not happen all at once. It was more like assembling a shattered window from thousands of pieces, where some fragments have letters, some have only edges, and some belong to a design nobody has seen before. Scholars compared repeated signs. They looked for patterns that might represent common words, names of kings, titles of gods, standard formulas in letters and legal records. They compared the unknown language with related Semitic languages, and slowly, with a mixture of logic, linguistic knowledge, and what must have been enormous patience, they began reading. One of the major clues came from the fact that ancient scribes, like modern bureaucrats, repeated themselves constantly. A tablet might begin with a familiar greeting. A list might use the same term again and again, for grain, sheep, wine, silver, or temple offerings. A royal document might include a king's name already known from other sources. Repetition is not always exciting when you're reading it, but for decipherment, repetition is gold. It gives you handholds. And then something remarkable happened. The tablets from Ugarit stopped being archaeological objects and became literature, not literature in the modern sense, with printed books and named authors and carefully preserved editions. These were texts copied by scribes onto clay, often probably from older oral traditions. Some were ritual texts telling priests what offerings to bring and when. Some were letters, contracts, inventories, school exercises, and diplomatic records. But some were myths, poems, narratives about the gods who ruled the world, fought one another, built palaces, descended into death, and struggled over the boundaries of order itself. For the first time, modern readers could hear the religious imagination of an ancient Canaanite city speaking in its own voice. Not perfectly, of course. Never perfectly. This is where it helps to slow down, because there is a temptation whenever an ancient text is deciphered to imagine that the past has suddenly become clear, as if someone opened a door, switched on a light, and there it was, the complete belief system of Ugarit, neatly arranged and ready for us to understand. But ancient tablets do not work that way, especially tablets that spent more than 3,000 years buried beneath a destroyed city. Many are broken. Some survive only as small fragments, a few lines at most. Others have their beginnings, but not their endings. Others preserve the middle of a story, while the names, actions, and crucial transitions have vanished into the missing edges. A line may read clearly until it reaches a break in the clay, and then the next words are simply gone. The god raised his weapon, perhaps. The enemy answered. Perhaps a messenger arrived. Perhaps something entirely different happened. The tablet cannot tell us, because the tablet no longer exists there. Even where the clay survives, the signs are not always certain. A wedge may be chipped, a corner may be worn away, a scribe may have written quickly or used an unusual spelling or made a mistake and corrected it. Sometimes scholars can restore a missing word because the same formula appears elsewhere. Sometimes a parallel passage helps. Sometimes the grammar strongly suggests what must have stood in the gap. And sometimes nobody knows. Translations often mark these moments with brackets, dots, or phrases like broken, uncertain. And perhaps those little marks can seem frustrating, but they are signs of honesty. They remind us that reconstruction is not the same thing as recovery. We have the voices of Ugarit, but we do not have every word they spoke. This matters especially when we come to the myths. A damaged line in an administrative account may leave us uncertain whether a shipment contained 20 jars of oil or 30. Interesting perhaps, but not world-changing. A damaged line in a divine poem can leave us uncertain why a god acts, who wins a confrontation, or what an image was meant to mean. One broken edge can change the shape of an entire interpretation. So the world of Ugarit comes to us partly illuminated and partly in shadow. We can see great figures moving through it. We can recognize their names, their rivalries, their homes, their powers. But there are always missing rooms in the house, corridors that end in rubble, sentences that trail off just when they seem about to explain everything. Still, what survives is extraordinary, because the Ugaritic alphabet gave the city a way to write its own language in a compact, adaptable script, and because clay, once dried and buried, can outlast wood, leather, parchment, and memory, that writing survived the destruction of the city itself. The palace fell, the temples burned, the merchants and priests and scribes disappeared into history, but their wedge-shaped alphabet remained, pressed into clay, waiting for someone thousands of years later to realize that these were not just tablets. They were a doorway, and beyond that doorway was a divine assembly, an old high god, a storm lord hungry for kingship, a sea that demanded obedience, and a death power waiting below the earth. But before we enter that divine assembly, there is something important to understand. The Ugaritic tablets are not one book. They are not a single sacred volume buried intact beneath the ruins of Ras Shamra, with a beginning on the first tablet and a neat conclusion on the last. Nobody at Ugarit walked into a temple library, took down a clay tablet labeled The Complete Story of Baal, and read it from cover to cover, the way we might read a novel. What archaeologists found was an archive, or rather several archives, scattered through different buildings and rooms of the ancient city. A city speaks in many voices, and Ugarit was no exception. There were letters, official messages sent between kings, merchants, officials, and foreign courts. There were contracts recording sales, debts, land, labor, and obligations. There were lists of goods, animals, offerings, names, rations, wine, oil, metal, grain. There were school exercises, the ancient equivalent of a student filling a page with repeated signs and vocabulary, trying to learn the difficult craft of writing. There were ritual instructions telling priests what to offer, which gods to honor, and on what day certain ceremonies were to be performed. And among all this practical clay bureaucracy, there were poems about gods. This is one of the reasons Ugarit feels so close and so strange. In the same civilization, perhaps within the same generation, one scribe could record a shipment of barley. Another could copy a treaty with a foreign ruler. Another could practice the alphabet. And another could preserve a poem about a storm god battling the sea for the right to rule. For the people who made these tablets, these things were not necessarily separate worlds. Politics, trade, ritual, family, farming, kingship, weather, death, and divine conflict were all woven together. If rain failed, that was not merely an agricultural problem. It could be understood as a disturbance in the balance of the cosmos. If a king made an alliance, the gods might be invoked as witnesses, if sacrifices were offered at the proper time. This was not just a private religious act. It was part of maintaining order in a city whose survival depended on harvests, diplomacy, and the favor of powers far larger than any human ruler. So when we read a mythological tablet from Ugarit, we should not picture a fantasy story sitting apart from real life. These poems belong to a world where stories about the gods could shape how people imagined authority, danger, justice, fertility, and the terrifying uncertainty of the seasons. The most famous of these mythological texts are usually gathered together under a modern name, the Baal cycle. That name is useful. It gives scholars and readers a way to talk about a connected group of tablets centered on Baal, the storm god. But it is also a modern convenience. The ancient tablets themselves do not arrive with a title page saying The Baal Cycle Volume 1. They do not always tell us where one story ends and another begins. Some are damaged. Some preserve only a section of a larger composition. Some may have been copied separately even if they belong to a broader sequence. Modern editions arrange them. Scholars give individual tablets labels. They identify scenes and episodes, Baal and Yam, Baal's Palace, Baal and Molt. These titles help us find our way through the fragments. But they are our signposts, not necessarily the ancient ones. Think of it like discovering pages from an unknown library after a building collapse. One page tells of a king's command, another gives a ritual calendar, another contains a poem, another repeats a list of syllables written by a student. Some pages clearly belong together, others might. Some may have been copied centuries apart, and every page is broken at the edges. You can build a map from what remains, but you must not mistake the map for the landscape. The Baal cycle, as scholars commonly reconstruct it, tells of Baal's struggle to establish his place among the gods. He confronts Yam, the sea, a force of untamed waters and dangerous power. He receives magnificent weapons made for divine war. He seeks a palace worthy of his authority. And later he faces Mot, death, whose realm reaches beneath the fertile world of rain and harvest. It is dramatic material, a storm god fighting the sea, claiming kingship, building a house on the holy mountain, and descending into the reach of death. It has the scale of a cosmic war, and yet it survives not as one smooth epic, but as a collection of clay tablets with missing corners, uncertain lines, and scribal notes at the end. Several of the major tablets were associated with a scribe named Ilimu. His name appears in colophons, those short statements scribes sometimes placed at the end of a text. A kophif might identify the person who wrote or copied the tablet, sometimes along with his family connection or his role in royal service. Ilimilu seems to have been an important court scribe, active in the late Bronze Age city of Ugarit. His name is linked to several of the great mythological compositions, including tablets connected with the Baal stories. That does not mean a Limel who invented Baal. The stories were probably older than any one scribe. They may have circulated orally for generations, changed by performers, priests, and storytellers, then copied and shaped in written form. Ilimilu may have been a composer, an editor, a copist, or some combination of all three. Ancient scribal work did not always fit the modern categories of author, publisher, and librarian. But his presence matters. It reminds us that these myths were written by human hands. Someone prepared the clay. Someone pressed the wedges into its damp surface. Line after careful line. Someone knew the old divine names, the traditional formulas, the rhythm of the poetry, and the proper way to preserve them in writing. Someone worked within a scribal culture connected to palace administration, education, diplomacy, and ritual life. The poems did not float down from heaven as isolated revelations. They were made, copied, handled, stored, and perhaps performed in a living city. And that brings us back to the archive. It can be tempting to take a line from a myth and pull it free from everything around it, to quote a god's speech as if it were a simple statement of doctrine, to see a familiar biblical word or an image that resembles a later tradition, and immediately declare that we have found the source of some much later belief. Sometimes comparisons are illuminating. Ugaritic is extraordinarily valuable for understanding the religious language of the ancient Levant. Its poems preserve divine names, images, and patterns of thought that appear in altered forms in neighboring cultures and later texts. But the tablets have to be allowed to speak from their own world first. A ritual tablet is not exactly the same thing as a myth. A royal letter is not exactly the same thing as a hymn. A school exercise is not exactly the same thing as a temple liturgy. Yet the boundaries can blur. A ritual may include poetic language. A poem may reflect royal ideals. A royal document may invoke gods whose stories were known across the city. The same divine world could appear in a sacrifice list, a personal name, a prayer, and a tale of heavenly conflict. That is why original context matters so much. Where was a tablet found? In a palace room, a temple area, a private house, or a scribal archive? What texts lay near it? Was it stored with diplomatic correspondence, ritual material, administrative accounts, or literary compositions? Was it written in Ugaritic, Ardean, Huran, or another language used in this cosmopolitan city? These questions do not always give easy answers, but they keep us from treating every tablet as if it were a detached quotation from a lost holy book. Ugarit was a port city at the edge of great powers. Ships came and went, merchants carried goods across the sea, kings negotiated with Egypt, Cyprus, the Hittite Empire, and cities throughout Syria and Mesopotamia. Scribes learned more than one language. Priests served more than one divine tradition. The archive reflects this complicated world, and within that world, the stories of Baal were not only stories of supernatural beings, they were also reflections on power itself. Who deserves a throne? Who controls the rain? Can order overcome chaos? Can life survive the force of death? What happens when a god builds a palace and claims a place among the rulers of heaven? The clay tablets do not answer these questions with a single official theology. They offer poetry, ritual, names, formulas, and fragments. They offer a world that has to be reconstructed slowly. But once we begin to read the fragments together, a pattern emerges. Above the human city, with its kings and scribes and storerooms full of grain, there is another court, older, stranger, and far more dangerous. At its head sits El, the aged father of the gods. El is not usually the god who rushes into battle. He does not arrive with thunder. He does not seize a weapon, strike an enemy, or send lightning across the sea. In the Ugaritic poems, those are more often the actions of Baal, the younger storm god whose victories and failures drive much of the drama to come. El is something older. He is the high god, the father, the patriarch seated at the summit of the divine order. His very name El simply means God in several ancient Semitic languages. That can make things confusing for modern readers. Sometimes a word that looks like a general word for deity is also the proper name of a particular god. But at Ugarit, El is unmistakably a distinct figure. He is not just any god. He is the senior god, the one at the head of the household of heaven. The poems give him titles that suggest strength, age, and authority. He is called the Bull El, an image that does not necessarily mean he looked like an animal, but that he possessed the force, fertility, dignity, and patriarchal power associated with the bull in the ancient Near East. He is called Father of Years, Father of Humanity, Creator of Creatures. In some interpretations of the texts, he is a source of legitimacy, a figure whose approval matters even when younger gods struggle for influence. Think of him as the old king at the center of a vast and complicated family. Not retired, not powerless, but not always the one doing the fighting. Around El gathers an assembly of divine beings. In Ugaritic texts, the gods can be described as the sons of El or as members of El's household. The language is familial, but it is also political. These are not merely children gathered around a father's table. They form a council, a heavenly court, a body of powerful beings with ranks, rivalries, obligations, and competing claims. This is one of the most important ideas preserved in the tablets. The universe, as these poems imagine, it is not governed by a lonely god standing apart from all other powers. It is governed through a divine assembly, a council in which decrees can be announced, petitions can be heard, messengers can travel, and the fate of gods and humans can be debated. The assembly is sometimes called the Sons of El, using a phrase related to later West Semitic expressions that speak of divine sons or members of a heavenly host. But we should slow down here because this is where ancient texts can become too familiar too quickly. The gods of Ugarit are not simply later angels wearing older names. They are gods in their own right. They eat and drink. They hold feasts. They receive offerings. They can be afraid, angry, wounded, ambitious, and even threatened. Some command rain, some rule death. Some embody sea, sun, fertility, war, craft, or royal power. They belong to a crowded supernatural world, not to the later, more sharply defined angelic hierarchies that developed in Jewish and Christian traditions. Still, the resemblance in language is worth noticing. Later biblical texts occasionally picture a heavenly council. There are scenes of divine beings standing before God. There are references to sons of God, heavenly hosts, messengers, princes of nations, and beings who participate in a celestial court. The details vary enormously from one text to another, and centuries separate many of these writings from the Ugaritic tablets. But Ugarit gives us a valuable window into the older West Semitic world from which some of this language emerged. Not a blueprint, not a direct script for later angelology, more like an old landscape beneath a newer city. The later buildings are not identical to what came before. They may have different walls, different rulers, different meanings, but sometimes far below the streets, the foundations still reveal the shape of an earlier world. At Ugarit, El's authority is expressed not only through titles, but through location. The gods do not govern from nowhere. They have a dwelling place, a mountain, a tent, a court at the edge of the ordered world. In some Ugaritic passages, El is associated with a remote sacred place near the sources of the rivers and the springs of the deep. This is strange and beautiful imagery. The high god sits at a place that is somehow both elevated and hidden, both mountain and cosmic frontier. He is near the origins of water where rivers begin and the underground deep rises toward the world. To ancient people living in a land where rain could determine survival, the sources of water were not ordinary geography. Springs, rivers, clouds, sea, and underground depths belonged to the hidden machinery of life. A god who dwelt near the sources of the rivers stood close to creation itself, close to the boundary where the visible world met the unknown. El's dwelling is also described in language of a tent or pavilion. That may sound modest to us. A tent seems temporary, portable, less impressive than a palace of stone. But in the ancient Near East, the royal tent could be a symbol of power. A king on campaign might issue commands from his tent. A patriarch's tent was the center of his household. A divine tent could be imagined as a sacred royal residence, a place of assembly where decisions were made and visitors approached with caution. This is not a quiet family home. It is a throne room under a canvas of heaven. The divine assembly gathers there. Messengers arrive there. Decisions made there echo outward into the world below. A god's status can be recognized there, challenged there, or denied there. If Baal wants true authority, it is not enough for him to be strong. It is not enough for him to defeat an enemy in open combat. He must have a recognized place within this heavenly order. And El seated at its head matters because he can grant or withhold legitimacy. The poems do not always portray him as perfectly decisive. At times El seems distant. At times he responds to pressure from other gods. At times his decisions appear to open the way for dangerous powers. This makes the divine world feel less like a simple chain of command and more like an ancient royal court full of ceremony, rivalry, persuasion, and tension. Reason the language of household and kingship is so closely joined. In the world of Ugarit, a household was not just parents and children. It included servants, dependents, messengers, estates, livestock, inheritance, labor, and authority. To call the gods El's children or household members was to place them within a structure of power. El was father, yes, but he was also lord of the family estate of heaven, and the estate was enormous. Above was the realm of cloud and star. Below was the human city. its fields waiting for rain, its ships crossing dangerous waters, its kings making treaties and sacrifices. Beneath all of this lay the depths, the sea, the underworld, the place of death, the hidden roots of rivers and mountains. The assembly of the gods stood at the center of this cosmic map. But a council is rarely peaceful for long. Among the gods gathered before El was Baal, the lord of storm and rain, and Baal was about to discover that in heaven, as on earth, power is never simply handed over. Baal was not the oldest god in the assembly. He was not the father of the gods. He was not the quiet authority seated near the sources of the rivers receiving petitions in the distant court of El. Baal was movement. He was the darkening sky before a storm, the sudden wind bending trees toward the ground, the crack of thunder rolling across the hills, the flash that lit the horizon for one impossible second, making the whole world visible, and then dark again. In the Ugaritic texts, Baal is the storm god. His name Hadu or Hadad in related traditions is connected with the great weather god known across much of the ancient Near East. At Ugarit, Baal is often simply called Baal, meaning Lord. But this was not a vague title. Everyone knew which Lord was meant, the Lord who brought rain. And in the Levant, rain was not just pleasant weather, it was survival. Picture the landscape around ancient Ugarit. Along the coast, the soil could be productive. Inland hills and plains supported grain, vines, olives, grazing animals, and small farming villages. But much of this depended on seasonal rainfall. There were rivers, springs, wells, and streams, of course. Yet, unlike Egypt with the predictable flood of the Nile, much of the Levant lived under a more uncertain rhythm. The rains had to come. If they arrived at the right time, seeds sprouted, barley and wheat rose from the earth, sheep and goats found pasture, grapes ripened, olive trees endured another year, granaries filled, families ate, kings collected taxes, temples received offerings. Trade continued. If the rains failed, the whole system began to tighten. Fields became dust, herds weakened, prices rose, debts multiplied. Parents watched stored grain disappear one handful at a time. A drought was not an abstract environmental problem. It was hunger moving through a city, a village, a household. So when the people of Ugarit imagined Baal riding through the sky, they were not imagining a decorative god of weather reports. They were imagining the force that opened the heavens. One of Baal's great titles is Rider of the Clouds. It is a beautiful title, but it is also a powerful one. To ride the clouds is to command the highest visible realm. A human king rides a chariot over roads and battlefields. Baal rides the storm front itself. His chariot is the rolling mass of cloud. His voice is thunder. His weapons are lightning and rain. The poetry makes nature feel alive, because for the people who first heard it, nature was alive with consequences. The cloud did not merely pass over a field, it carried the possibility of bread. Thunder was not merely noise, it announced that the Lord of fertility might be near. And Baal's power reaches beyond rain alone. He is linked to abundance, growth, and the returning life of the land. This does not mean that every plant was thought to be a tiny piece of Baal, or that the Ugaritic people had one simple nature religion. Ancient religion was more complicated than that. Fields depended on labor, soil, animals, seasons, irrigation where possible, family cooperation, and sheer luck. But divine power was understood to stand behind the fragile order that made all of this possible. Baal mattered because he represented the necessary victory of life over barrenness, at least the victory that everyone hoped would come. But here is where the Ugaritic stories become much more interesting than a simple tale about a mighty storm god. Baal is powerful, extremely powerful. He can shake mountains, he can send rain, he can defeat enemies, he can make other gods tremble. Yet when the poems begin, he is not simply the unquestioned king of heaven. That role belongs in a deeper and older sense to El. Baal has force, El has seniority. Baal has the storm, El has the assembly, and those are not the same thing. A god can be dangerous without being legitimate. A warrior can win battles without holding the throne. A young prince can have followers, weapons, and ambition, yet still need recognition from the old king and the royal court. That is the position Baal seems to occupy. He must win his place. This is the central tension running through the Baal cycle, the famous group of Ugaritic poems that preserve his struggles. The question is not only whether Baal can defeat rival powers, the question is whether his strength can be transformed into recognized rule. Can the storm god become the god whose authority is established within the divine order? Can he receive a palace? Can he issue commands? Can he take his place among the rulers of the cosmos? For an ancient audience, these questions would have felt very real. A palace was not just a nice house. A palace meant permanence. Administration, tribute, messengers at the gate, servants carrying orders. A visible center of authority. To have no palace was in a sense to lack a settled claim. Baal may be strong enough to roar from the clouds, but strength alone does not guarantee a throne room. And that is why Baal's story carries a strange kind of suspense. We know what the storm can do. Every season proves it. The sky can turn black in an hour. Wind can flatten crops or revive them. Rain can bring life while lightning can bring terror. Baal's power is obvious. It is written across the landscape. But the poems ask whether obvious power is enough. The answer, at least at first, is no. The divine world is not a simple meritocracy where the strongest god automatically rules. It is a court. There are inherited ranks. There are decrees. There are negotiations. There are older powers with their own claims. There are figures who can speak to El, persuade him, pressure him, or carry messages between rival sides. This is one reason the Ugaritic tablets feel so vivid. The gods do not exist in a perfectly orderly universe. They inhabit a world where authority has to be defended, confirmed, and sometimes fought over. It would be easy to read all of this as straightforward political propaganda. A storm god wins, a king wins, a palace is built, order is restored. The message perhaps is that earthly kings should be obeyed because heaven itself is a monarchy. There may be something to that. Ancient royal power and divine power were often imagined in related language. Kings built palaces, received tribute, defeated enemies, and presented themselves as guardians of fertility and order. Temples and courts reinforced one another. A myth about divine kingship could certainly echo the concerns of human kingship, but it is not only propaganda. The Baal cycle does not give us a simple, flattering picture of power always working smoothly. Baal's authority is uncertain. El is not always decisive. Other gods resist, threaten, bargain, and mourn. The cosmic order can fracture. Even the god of rain can face defeat. That is not the tidy story of a ruler who has everything under control. It is a mythic exploration of a harder truth. Life depends on powers that humans cannot command. Rain must come, but it may not. The sea feeds cities through trade, but it can also destroy ships. Death waits below every harvest and every victory. The world is ordered but never completely safe. Baal stands at the center of that uncertainty. He is the hopeful god, the god of clouds gathering over thirsty ground, the god whose arrival means fields may live again. But he is also a contender, not yet secure, surrounded by forces older, stranger, and more dangerous than a summer storm, and the first great challenge is already rising. It comes from the sea, from the restless, untamed waters called Yam. Yam. The word means sea. But in the Baal cycle, Yam is not only the Mediterranean lying beyond the harbor at Ugarit. He is a god, a ruler, a claimant to power within the divine assembly. He is also called Niha River, which may sound peaceful to us at first. A river can mean water for crops, a route for trade, a place to fish. But ancient rivers could also flood, shift their channels, tear away fields, and carry people beyond help. Sea and river, in this myth, are not gentle sources of life. They are vast waters with their own will, and Yam wants more than respect. He wants authority. This is where the story turns from a dispute among gods into something much more dangerous. Baal, the rider of the clouds, is not facing an enemy who simply wants to fight him in the open. Yam uses the language of the court. He sends messengers. He makes demands. He presses his claim through the established order of heaven. The surviving tablets are damaged in places, as ancient tablets so often are. Lines break off. Names vanish into cracks. A few words remain where a whole speech once stood, but enough survives to create an unforgettable scene. Messengers of Yam arrive at the divine assembly. They come before El, the aged head of the gods, and before the gathered council, and they do not behave like humble envoys arriving at the court of a superior king. They do not bow. They do not lower their eyes. They stand with a kind of frightening confidence, as if the power behind them is already greater than everyone in the room. The other gods react. The poetry suggests that they lower their heads. They sit in dread. The assembly, normally the place where decrees are made and authority is confirmed, becomes silent under pressure. It is a remarkable moment. These are gods, immortal powers, lords of mountains, stars, crafts, fertility, plague, fire, and battle. Yet the ambassadors of the sea enter their hall, and the divine council seems to shrink before them. Baal does not accept this. In one striking passage, he rebukes the gods for their fear. Why lower your heads before the envoys of Yam? Why let messengers make the assembly tremble? It is exactly the kind of response we might expect from Baal. He is not patient. He is not cautious in the manner of El. Baal is motion, impact, thunder, breaking a long silence. Where others see an unavoidable power, he sees an enemy that must be resisted, but resistance has consequences. Yam's demand is aimed at Baal himself. The exact wording is difficult because the text is incomplete and translations differ in their details. But the meaning is clear enough. Yam seeks control over Baal. He demands that Baal be handed over, that the storm god becomes subordinate to him, perhaps even his servant or captive. Think about what that would mean. If Yam rules, Baal does not. The god who brings rain, who opens the clouds and renews the fields, would stand beneath the sea. The storm would be contained. The life-giving force of the heavens would be forced to submit to the deep, restless waters. And for people living on the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, this was not merely an abstract theological problem. The sea was beautiful. It was also dangerous in a way that could not be ignored. Ugarit was a trading city. Ships linked its people to Cyprus, Egypt, Anatolia, the Iron World, Mesopotamia, and ports whose names are now lost. Through the sea came copper, timber, luxury goods, pottery, ideas, languages, visitors, and wealth. The sea made it connected, but every ship that left harbor entered a world no king could control. A sudden storm could scatter a fleet. Hidden rocks could split a hull. Wind could drive sailors far from shore. Cargo could vanish. Men could vanish. A family waiting at the harbor might never learn what happened beyond the horizon. Even the familiar coast could become terrifying. Winter storms threw waves against the shore. Floodwaters surged through channels. Salt water could destroy fertile ground. The sea did not plant grain. It did not respect field boundaries. It did not arrive gently and leave when asked. So when Yam appears as a threatening divine power, he is not just a metaphor for chaos in the modern literary sense. He is chaos, but chaos understood as something people could encounter directly. A storm at sea, a river in flood, the dark water below a ship. The horizon that promises trade and disaster in equal measure. This is one of the ways ancient myths work. They do not begin with a neat symbolic equation where sea equals danger and storm equals hope. They begin with real experiences. Water gives life. Water destroys life. The same sea that brings a merchant vessel home can swallow another vessel before dawn. The same rain Baal sends can nourish crops or become a violent flood. The gods give these unstable realities faces, voices, alliances, and ambitions. And Yam's ambition belongs to a much wider pattern across the ancient Near East. Again and again, old stories from the region imagine a great conflict between a god associated with order, kingship, storm, or creation, and a watery power associated with the untamed, deep. In Babylonian tradition, the god Marduk battles Tiamat, the primordial sea. In Hittite stories from Anatolia, Storm gods struggle against serpentine and watery enemies. Egyptian traditions knew the dangerous sea serpent Apophis who threatened the solar order night after night. Later, biblical poetry sometimes speaks of the sea, the deep or sea monsters as powers only the high god can master. The similarities are real, but that does not mean the Ugaritic story is simply copying one myth from another. Ancient cultures traded goods, traveled, fought, intermarried, borrowed words, and listened to each other's stories. Ideas moved across borders. Certain images were powerful enough to appear again and again. The storm god, the dragon, the sea, the mountain, the royal palace, the battle that establishes order. But Ugarit gives us its own cast of characters, its own El seated at the head of the assembly, its own Baal ambitious and not yet secure, its own Yam pressing his claim through messengers and decrees, its own drama where the question is not just how the world began, but who will rule it now. And that question is becoming impossible to avoid. The assembly has been intimidated. Yam's envoys have spoken. Baal has been named as the one who must submit. For a moment, heaven itself seems to hesitate. Then Baal begins to move from anger toward action, because there are demands that can be negotiated, and there are demands that make war inevitable. War is inevitable, but Baal does not rush straight from anger into battle. Before the storm god can face Yam, he needs something more than courage. He needs weapons. And in the world of the Ugaritic tablets, weapons worthy of a god, and not simply found lying on a battlefield. They must be made by a god who understands making itself. His name is Kofar Wakasis. The name is often translated as skillful and wise or clever and wise. It tells us almost everything about his role. Ka is the divine craftsman, the inventor, the builder, the god who can turn raw material into power. He is not introduced as the strongest god in the assembly. He does not command storms, rule the dead, or threaten the world with floods. His power is different. He knows how things fit together. He knows the secret of crafted objects, of tools, structures, devices, and weapons. In later parts of the Baal cycle, Kothar will build a palace. Here, before there can be a palace, before Baal can claim a throne, there must be a victory. So, the craftsman goes to work. It is a quietly important moment in the myth. Baal has strength. He has fury. He has the force of rain and thunder behind him. But even a storm god needs expertise. He needs the work of hands, planning, and knowledge. Divine kingship, the tablets seem to suggest, is not won by brute force alone. It depends on craft. Ka fashions two weapons for Baal. Does not merely hand them over. He gives them names. This is ancient poetry. So names matter. A named weapon is not just a piece of metal or wood. It has a purpose, a voice almost. It is a force directed toward a particular enemy. The first weapon is called Yagrush. Its name is often translated as driver. The second is called Ayamur. Its name is often translated as chaser. Driver and chaser. They sound less like ordinary clubs or spears than commands made solid. One drives the enemy from his place. The other pursues him until there is nowhere left to run. Ka speaks to the weapons as he creates them. The wording varies slightly between translations because the tablets are old, broken, and difficult. But the pattern is clear. The craftsman addresses the weapon directly and tells it what it must do. He tells driver to strike Yam. He tells it to drive sea from his throne. Then he speaks to chaser. Chase, Naha river strike him. Bring down the power that has made the divine assembly tremble. It is a remarkable piece of writing. The weapons are not passive objects. They are participants in the battle. Ka's skill gives them identity, and language gives them a mission. Perhaps that is why the scene feels so dramatic, even after more than 3,000 years. You can almost sense the pause before the blow. Yam has sent messengers into El's council. He has made demands. He has sought Baal's submission. For a moment, the gods lowered their heads. Now Baal stands armed. He lifts Yagrush driver and he strikes. The first blow lands on Yam, but Yam does not fall. This matters. In many later retellings of ancient myths, divine combat can become simple. One god raises a weapon, one monster collapses, order wins, in a single clean moment. The Ugaritic poem gives us something more tense. Baal strikes Yam, yet the sea remains standing. The blow has force, but not enough. Yam absorbs it. The ancient waters do not surrender easily. The danger that threatened heaven is still there. So Baal takes up the second weapon, Ayamor Chaser. Again, the poetry becomes direct and physical. Baal swings the weapon. He strikes Yam. The surviving text describes the blow landing with terrible force, though the precise body part can differ depending on how scholars reconstruct the damaged lines and translate the words around them. Yam is struck in the head or between the shoulders or in the chest in the poetic violence of the scene, and this time he collapses. Sea falls, river falls. The force that demanded Baal's surrender is broken. But even here we should be careful not to make the story flatter than it is. The tablets do not preserve every line of the battle in perfect condition. There are gaps, there are broken edges. Some of the sequence must be reconstructed from what survives. Scholars can be confident about the broad movement of the scene. Ka makes weapons, Baal uses them, Yam is defeated. Yet some details remain uncertain, like fragments of a thunderstorm heard from far away. That uncertainty is part of the atmosphere of Ugarit. Book copied and recopied in a complete manuscript. We are listening through cracks in clay. A word survives, a line disappears. Then, suddenly a weapon has a name, a god falls, and the whole ancient world seems to shake. What does the battle mean? One possible reading is that Baal's victory represents order overcoming a destabilizing force. Yam is not evil in a modern sense. The sea is not morally wicked. Rivers are not villains because they flood. But Yam represents a power that cannot be contained by ordinary boundaries. He is the sea beyond the harbor, the flood beyond the field, the water that refuses to remain where people need it. Baal, by contrast, is a god of storm and rain. He too is dangerous. A storm can kill, lightning can burn, rain can become floodwater. But Baal's power is also seasonal, agricultural, and renewing. Rain falls, grain grows, life returns. So Baal's victory may express a hope that the dangerous forces of the world can be brought into a workable balance, not destroyed forever. Perhaps the sea still exists, rivers still rise, but they do not take the throne. This is one reason the story has echoes elsewhere in the ancient Near East. Storm gods fighting sea powers appear in several traditions. The Babylonian god Marduk battles Tiamat. In Anatolian stories, storm gods confront dragons and watery enemies. Later biblical poems can imagine the sea, the deep, or sea creatures, as forces subdued by the power of Israel's God. The resemblance is real, but caution matters. These stories did not all come from one original script, copied perfectly from city to city. They developed across centuries among cultures that traded, traveled, and shared a broad imaginative world. Sea, storm, mountain, serpent, king, palace, and divine battle were powerful images. Different peoples shaped them into different stories, and Ugarit's version remains distinct. Here the battle is not only about creating the world from primordial waters, it is about Baal earning the right to rule. He has refused submission. He has received weapons from the divine craftsman. He has struck down the challenger who wanted him bound. But defeating Yam is not the end of Baal's struggle. A warrior may win a battle and still lack a palace. And in the next movement of the tale, Baal will discover that victory is only the beginning of kingship. But what exactly does a victory mean if no one recognizes what it has changed? Baal has defeated Yam. The sea has fallen. The threat has been driven back. The storm god has proved that he cannot be chained, handed over, or made to serve a rival power. And yet, Baal still does not have a palace. This may sound like a small problem after a cosmic battle. He has just defeated the sea. Surely, a god who can break Yam with a named weapon can build himself a house. But in the world of the Ugaritic tablets, a palace is not just a house, It is a public statement of rank. A king has a palace. A king has a throne room, servants, messengers, a place from which orders travel outward. A king receives tribute there. He holds court there. His authority has walls around it, doors before it, and a permanent place in the landscape. Without a palace, Baal is powerful, but his position remains unfinished. He can win a battle, but can he rule? This is the question that moves through the next part of the Baal cycle. Baal looks around the divine world and sees that other great gods have houses. El, the aged father figure at the head of the assembly, has his dwelling. The gods have their places, but Baal, despite his victory, remains without a proper palace. The poem gives this complaint emotional weight. Baal is not simply asking for nicer accommodations. He is asking why his authority has not been recognized. Why should the God whose rains feed the fields, whose thunder shakes the sky, whose victory has protected the divine order, remain without a house of cedar, stone, and shining metal? It is a surprisingly human problem. A person can do the work, win the argument, carry the burden, and still find that the official title has gone to someone else. Power is one thing, recognition is another. Baal has power. Now he needs recognition, and this is where the goddesses step forward. Anat, Baal's fierce ally, is not known for patience. In the wider cycle, she is a figure of violence, loyalty, and terrifying energy. She fights enemies, she mourns fiercely, she acts when others hesitate. But she can also move through the politics of the divine court. The tablets suggest that Baal's cause needs advocates. Winning against Yam did not automatically force El to grant him a palace. There are still negotiations to make, gifts to offer, status to protect, words to choose carefully. Then there is Asher. Asher is a major goddess in the Ugaritic pantheon, often called Atharat in the tablets. She is closely associated with El and appears as a motherly, diplomatic, and politically important figure among the gods. Her role here is especially interesting. Baal's request for a palace is not a simple matter, because a new palace changes the balance of heaven. If Baal receives one, he becomes more than a successful warrior. He becomes a settled ruler, a god with a permanent court on the holy mountain that could affect everyone. So, the poems present a kind of divine diplomacy. Anat pushes Baal's case. Asher becomes involved in the process. In some readings, she is initially reluctant, perhaps wary of Baal's rising power. In others, the damaged and difficult text leaves the exact emotional sequence less certain. But the broad movement is clear enough. Baal needs Asher's support, and support in an ancient royal court is often obtained through gifts. The poems describe costly offerings, luxuries suitable for a high goddess. Gold, silver, fine objects. The language is ceremonial and abundant. These are not casual presents. They are signals of respect, alliance, and obligation. This is not necessarily bribery in the modern sense. Gift-giving was part of diplomacy across the ancient Near East. Kings sent gifts to kings. Cities sent tribute. Families exchanged valuable objects to create bonds that words alone could not guarantee. The gods of Ugarit do the same. They live in a world that looks in many ways like the royal courts known to the people who told these stories. There are messengers, there are negotiations, there are disputes over rank, there are gifts that open doors. Eventually the question reaches El, should Baal have a palace? And the answer, after all the tension, is yes. Baal is granted the right to build. This is the moment where victory becomes kingship. But Baal will not construct the palace himself. Once again the story turns to Ka-Wakasis, the skilled and wise craftsman who made the weapons that defeated Yam. Kthar understands how to turn power into something lasting. He is called upon to build Baal's house on Mount Saffron. Saffron, often identified with Jebel al-Akra, rose north of Ugarit near the Mediterranean coast. It was a real mountain visible from the broader region, often wrapped in cloud and storm for the people of Ugarit. It was not merely geography. It was Baal's mountain, the place where storm clouds gathered, the place from which thunder could roll across the land. The palace on Saffron is therefore not just a building placed on a hill. It is the center of Baal's cosmic authority, a heavenly palace on the mountain of storms. Ka begins building. The descriptions are rich with precious materials: silver, gold, lapis-like brilliance, cedarwood. The palace is made to shine. It is a structure fit for a god whose arrival is marked by lightning. And then the story pauses over a detail that seems almost strange: a window. Ka wants to put a window in Baal's palace. Baal refuses. At first, he does not want one. Why? The text does not stop and give us a neat explanation. Ancient myths rarely do. They expect their first audience to understand references that are now partly lost to us. Perhaps Baal fears an opening through which enemies might enter. Perhaps a window represents vulnerability in a new palace, especially for a god who has only recently secured his position. Perhaps the image has a ritual meaning that is no longer fully clear. But Ka insists a palace needs its opening, and eventually Baal agrees. The window is made. Then Baal opens it. And this is no ordinary window. From it, Baal sends out his voice. Thunder rolls. Lightning flashes. The earth trembles beneath the sound of the storm god's command. The palace window becomes an opening between heaven and earth. Baal does not merely sit inside his new house. He acts from it. His voice goes out over the world. Rain, thunder, and terrifying power emerge from the mountain palace. It is a beautiful image. The storm clouds gather around Saffron. The sky darkens somewhere above the fields and the sea, beyond ordinary human reach. Baal opens the window of his palace, and the world hears him. This may be why the window mattered so much. A sealed palace would show that Baal had a home, but an open window shows that he has reach. He can send his power outward. He can speak across the heavens. He can make the mountains shake and the clouds release rain. Architecture becomes theology. The palace proves that Baal has been accepted among the great powers of heaven. The window proves that his authority is active. He is not simply a god with a throne. He is the king whose voice moves through the storm. And yet even now Baal's kingship is not completely secure. A palace can protect a ruler from disorder outside its gates. It cannot guarantee peace within the universe because another power is waiting. Not the sea, not the river. Something quieter, hungrier, and harder to defeat. Its name is Mot, death. But before Mo speaks from the depths, it is worth pausing over the figures who have already helped shape Baal's rise. Because Baal does not stand alone. The world of the Ugaritic tablets is crowded with powers, relatives, allies, messengers, rivals, craftsmen, mothers, warriors, and old gods whose authority cannot be reduced to a simple chart. At the center stands El, the aged divine father, seated at the head of the council. Around him are the gods, sometimes called the sons of El, a heavenly household that looks less like a modern chain of command and more like a royal court with ancient family tensions. Baal is powerful, but he is not the only power, and among the most important figures around him are two goddesses whose roles are impossible to ignore. Anat and Asher. They are very different figures. Anat is Baal's close ally, perhaps his sister in the language of the myths, though divine family terms do not always work exactly as they would in an ordinary human genealogy. She is young, fierce, active, and frightening. She fights, she threatens, she grieves. She carries messages and intervenes when the other gods hesitate. If Baal is the storm breaking over the mountain, Anat is the force that moves through the battlefield after it. The poems give her images of almost unbearable violence. In one famous and difficult passage, Anat is described fighting enemies with a kind of ecstatic fury. She wades through blood. She strikes down warriors. The language is vivid, ritualized, and probably deliberately shocking. For a modern reader, it can feel brutal, and it should. These are not gentle stories about harmless sky figures. They come from a world where war, drought, famine, disease, and sudden death were close realities. The gods were imagined as beings large enough to contain the terror of those realities. But we should be careful here. The surviving tablets are broken, their poetry is dense, their words can have several meanings. Some passages may refer to mythic enemies, others to ritual action, others to images that were already traditional when the tablets were written down. We cannot always tell exactly what an ancient audience understood when Anat lifted her weapons. What we can say is that Anat is not a background character. She does not sit quietly beside a throne while male gods decide the fate of the universe. She acts. When Baal needs support for his palace, Anat presses his cause. When Baal later faces disaster, she will mourn him with a grief powerful enough to shake the story itself. She is loyal, dangerous, and capable of moving between battle and diplomacy without becoming any less formidable. There is something almost unsettling about her. Ancient myths often divide women into simple categories: mother, maiden, lover, victim, temptress. Anat refuses to stay inside any of them. She can be called a maiden and still be a warrior. She can be close to Baal and still have her own agency, her own rage, her own terrifying presence. If you enjoy these old mysteries, the strange fragments that force us to read slowly and imagine carefully, you can find the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries through the website. The link is in the description. It goes deeper into the kinds of questions that ancient texts leave open, sometimes for thousands of years. And then there is Asher called Atharat in the Ugaritic tablets, where Anat arrives with force. Asher often arrives with status. She is associated with El, and she is frequently described in maternal terms, especially as a mother of gods. But mother should not make us imagine someone powerless or withdrawn from public life. In an ancient royal household, a mother figure could possess enormous influence. She could have access, prestige, allies, wealth, and the ability to shape decisions without holding a weapon herself. Asher has all of this. She is a great lady of the divine household. She receives gifts, she negotiates, she intercedes. Her support matters because she is woven into the structure of heaven itself. When Baal seeks a palace, the story does not simply show him marching up to El and demanding one. His rise has to pass through relationships. Anat advocates Asher is approached, gifts are brought, El's decision waits at the end of a process. That is important. The Ugaritic gods are not arranged in a clean pyramid with one absolute ruler at the top and everyone else mechanically obeying below. El has seniority. He presides over the assembly. His approval matters deeply. But Baal can become the active king of storms. Asher can influence the direction of divine politics. Anat can transform a crisis through direct action. Ka can create the weapons and architecture that make kingship possible. Power is distributed. It shifts depending on the problem. A sea god may threaten the world. A storm god may defeat him. But a palace still requires diplomacy. And diplomacy may depend on a goddess whose place in El's household gives her influence no battlefield victory can replace. This is one reason the tablets feel so alive. Their gods are not abstract labels attached to natural forces. They have pride. They have obligations. They need recognition. They form alliances. They carry old grievances. They mourn their dead. They resemble a divine family, but not a peaceful one. More like an ancient court where every feast, every gift, every marriage connection, every insult and every request might change the balance of power. And this complexity matters when we come to Mot, because Baal's palace on Mount Sun may look secure. Its walls shine, its window opens, its thunder reaches across the earth. But neither Anat's violence nor Asher's influence can make death disappear. They can negotiate with El. They can defend Baal's interests. They can grieve and retaliate. But Mo is not simply another rival waiting to be defeated in a fair contest. Mot is hunger beneath the ground, the dry season, the grave, the mouth that opens for every living thing, and soon even Baal, king of clouds and rain, will hear that mouth speak. Mot is not like Yam. Yam was the wild sea, the floodwater, the force that threatened to break boundaries and drag the world back toward chaos. Baal could meet him with weapons. He could strike him down. He could establish order against him. But Mot is something deeper. Mot means death. And in the world of the Ugaritic tablets, death is not merely the quiet ending of one human life. Mot is a divine power. He belongs to the depths, to the underworld, to the dry and devouring forces that wait beneath the surface of the living world. He is hunger when the grain fails. He is drought when the clouds disappear. He is the grave opening beneath kings and farmers, warriors and children, animals and gods. Baal rules the storm. He sends rain. His thunder shakes the mountain. His palace stands on Saphon, high above the earth, with a window through which the weather pours into the world. Mot has no need for a mountain palace. His realm is below, and that difference matters. You can see a storm coming. You can watch clouds gather on the horizon. You can hear thunder before it arrives. But death works differently. It is already present in the soil, in the famine that follows a failed harvest, in the darkness behind the doorway of the tomb. It does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it simply opens its mouth. And Mot's mouth is one of the most disturbing images in the entire Baal cycle. The surviving poems describe him in the language of appetite. He is not just an enemy who wants territory or tribute. He wants to consume. His lips stretch from earth to heaven. His tongue reaches toward the stars. He opens his jaws. And what lies between them is the whole world. It is an enormous image. Picture it, the earth below, the high heavens above, and between them a mouth so wide that gods, people, mountains, rain clouds, and cities could all disappear into it. This is not realistic description. Of course it is mythic poetry, but it captures something ancient people knew with terrible clarity. Hunger can feel limitless. Drought can seem to swallow an entire land. Death does not negotiate according to ordinary rules. The tablets preserve a threatening exchange between Mo and Baal, though as always the exact sequence is difficult to reconstruct from broken clay. Mut sends his demand. Baal is to come down into the realm of death. He is to acknowledge Mo's power. In some translations, Mo speaks almost like a host inviting a guest to a meal. But the guest is also the meal. That is the horror of it. Mot's invitation is not an invitation to feast at a table. It is an invitation to be devoured. Eat and drink. Mo seems to say, "Come down, enter my domain, and then you will know what all living beings know. In the end, you will be swallowed for Baal." This is a different kind of crisis from the battle with Yam. Against Yam, Baal was the challenger. He was the rising storm god, armed with divine weapons, fighting to secure his place among the gods. Victory brought him recognition. It helped establish his kingship. It led toward the building of his palace on the holy mountain. That conflict was dramatic, violent, and dangerous. There was an opponent, there were weapons, there was a blow that could be struck. Mot is not so easily handled. What weapon defeats the grave? What palace can keep famine outside its gates? What thunder can command the dead to rise? Baal's struggle with Mot is therefore not simply another episode in which the hero defeats a monster and takes another step upward. It is a confrontation with the limit of power itself. Baal may rule rain, but rain does not fall forever. The fields may turn green, but then the heat returns. The grain ripens, then it is cut. Life rises, then it goes down. For this reason, many scholars have seen the Baal and Mot story as connected to the agricultural cycle of the Eastern Mediterranean. Baal's power is often associated with storm, fertility, and the rains that make cultivation possible. Mot is associated with dryness, death, and the dangerous season when the land becomes hard and the green world seems to vanish. It is easy to see why that interpretation became popular in a place dependent on seasonal rainfall. The disappearance of the rains could be terrifying. A few failed seasons could mean hunger, debt, migration, disease, and death. When the skies closed, it might have seemed as if Baal himself had gone silent. And when the rains returned, when the fields revived after the dry months, it could feel like a divine victory over the power that had held the land in its grip. But we should move carefully. The Ugaritic poems are not instruction manuals for a simple seasonal religion. They do not say in a neat and modern way, Baal equals spring, Mot equals summer, and the myth is only an allegory of crops. The surviving texts are richer and stranger than that. They are about kingship. They are about divine hierarchy. They are about mortality, rain, ritual, hunger, grief, and the terrifying fact that even a god of life-giving weather can be summoned into the depths. Mot is not merely a cartoon villain trying to ruin the harvest. He represents something unavoidable. The people of ancient Ugarit did not need mythology to tell them that death existed. They saw it everywhere in the cemetery, in childhood illness, in war, in shipwrecks, in the long dry months when the last stored grain had to last until the next rains. The myth gave that reality a voice, and Mot's voice is cold. The message reaches Baal on his mountain. The king of storms, the god whose thunder once broke Yam's power, now receives words from below. The poetry makes the moment feel almost ceremonial. Messengers travel, instructions are given. Boundaries between realms are crossed, but behind the formal language is a simple threat. Come down. Baal's response is difficult to read in every detail because the tablets are damaged and the story may preserve several layers of tradition. Yet the broad movement is clear enough. Baal does not simply march into battle. He prepares, he sends word, he takes precautions that sound almost desperate. In one part of the story, he is associated with a substitute or a figure made to resemble him, a detail that has puzzled readers for generations. Is this deception, a ritual pattern, a lost piece of the narrative? The broken text does not allow complete certainty. What matters is that Baal is no longer standing secure in the bright upper world. He is moving toward Mot, toward the place from which no ordinary messenger returns. And then the unthinkable happens. The storm god disappears. The rains stop. The voice from the mountain falls silent. Soon the gods will search for Baal. Soon Anat will mourn. Soon the whole world will feel the absence of the one who made the clouds gather. But first, there is only the message from the depths. The mouth has opened, and Baal has gone down. Then the news begins to move upward, not with thunder, not with a messenger racing across the mountain in triumph. With silence, the tablets describe Baal as dead, or at least as having entered the condition of death so completely that the gods speak of him as lost. The storm lord has gone down into Mo's domain. The god of clouds, rain, and fertile fields has vanished beneath the earth. And when Baal disappears, the world feels empty. This is not just grief for one powerful god. Baal's absence threatens the whole structure of life. Without the storm, there is no rain. Without rain, the soil hardens. Seeds remain buried. Herds weaken. Storehouses become more precious than palaces. A kingdom can survive an enemy at its gates for a while. It cannot survive forever if the sky gives nothing. The old god El hears the report. El is not Baal's rival in this moment. He is the aged head of the divine family, the fatherly figure seated at the source of authority, and his response is raw. In the surviving poetry, El descends from his throne, mourns in dust and ashes, cuts himself, tears at his beard, and cries out in grief. It is an extraordinary picture. The highest God is not distant. He is not calmly observing events from beyond sorrow. He mourns like a father who has received news that cannot be undone. He marks his body. He covers himself with dust. He asks, "What will become of the world without Baal?" That question hangs over the story. What happens when the rainbringer is gone? What happens when divine kingship itself seems to have failed? For listeners in a land shaped by seasonal drought, this was not abstract theology. The disappearance of Baal could be felt in a brown field, an empty system, a child watching adults measure the grain jars again and again. The myth does not need to say that every dry season was Baal's death, but it makes the connection emotionally unavoidable. When the heavens close, it can feel as if the god has gone below. El's mourning is followed by a search, and the one who searches most fiercely is Anat. Anat is Baal's sister ally, and in some texts, something more complex than either of those modern words can capture. She is a goddess of battle and fierce protection. Earlier in the cycle, she has already shown that she is not gentle when Baal's position is threatened. She can wade into violence without hesitation. She can demand action from the high gods. She can turn grief into force. Now she goes looking for Baal. The text is damaged as much of the Baal cycle is damaged. We do not have every step of her journey. We cannot reconstruct every line that was once spoken, but the broad shape survives. Anat finds Baal's body or finds him in the realm of death and takes him up. She carries him. She weeps for him. She buries him on the heights of Saffron, Baal's own holy mountain. The image is strange and powerful. The god whose palace stood on the mountain, whose voice was thunder, is now laid in the ground. The ruler above the clouds has become the object of funeral rites. And then Annette turns toward Moat. This is where the surviving poem becomes both vivid and difficult. The lines are famous because they are so violent. Annette seizes Moat. She cuts him. She burns him. She grinds him. She scatters him across the fields. The language is not delicate. It is the language of vengeance pushed beyond ordinary battle. Anat does not merely defeat death in a fair contest. She treats him like grain being processed at harvest, like an enemy being reduced, broken down, scattered. That agricultural imagery may be important. Moat is death, drought, hunger, the devouring power beneath life. Anat attacks him with images of threshing, burning, and sowing. The one who consumes is himself consumed by the cycle of the land. But even here we need to be careful. Mo is not erased from existence. This is one of the deepest points in the whole story. Death can be attacked. It can be driven back. It can lose its grip for a time. But Mo is not just another monster whose defeat permanently cleans up the universe. He is part of reality. He belongs to a world where every harvest ends, everybody dies, every season turns, and in the tablets, Mo eventually speaks again. Before that happens, though, something changes. Baal returns. The poems tell us that after a period of absence, Baal is alive again, restored to his place. The rain god returns to his throne. The storm is heard once more. The world can breathe. It is tempting to use the word resurrection here, and in a broad sense it makes immediate sense. Baal goes down into death, is mourned, and returns to life and kingship. That pattern has invited comparisons for a very long time. But ancient traditions do not always fit neatly into later categories. The Ugaritic texts are not Christian texts. They are not later Jewish texts. They do not give us a single systematic doctrine explaining what resurrection means for every god or every human being. The tablets are poetic, fragmented, and rooted in a Bronze Age Canaanite world with its own rituals and assumptions. So it is safest to say that Baal is restored after death or descent, rather than assuming the story means exactly what resurrection means in any later religious tradition. Still, the force of the return is unmistakable. Baal's restoration means more than personal survival. It means rain returning to the earth. It means fertility returning to fields and herds. It means the divine order has not collapsed. And because Baal is a kingly figure, his return also carries the language of royal stability. A good king in the imagination of the ancient Near East was not merely a man wearing a crown. His rule was linked to justice, abundance, protection, and the proper ordering of the world. When Baal takes his place again, the cosmic kingdom is functioning. The mountain has its lord, the clouds have their rider. The land can receive its life-giving water, but Moat has not accepted this quietly. The final conflict is not a clean ending. Baal and Moat confront each other again. They accuse, they threaten, they struggle for dominance, and the outcome is shaped not simply by strength, but by authority. A message from Shamash, the sun goddess who travels across heaven and sees the boundaries between worlds, reminds Moat that El has favored Baal's kingship. Moat must yield, not because death has vanished, not because drought will never return, not because the world has become permanently safe. He yields because there is an order above the conflict, a balance that even Moat cannot finally overthrow. That is how the cycle closes. Baal reigns, Moat remains, rain returns, death waits, and the world continues. Not because chaos has been destroyed forever, but because it has been restrained long enough for life to rise again. But if death remains, then who lives within its shadow? The Ugaritic tablets give us one answer in a word that looks familiar but becomes strange the closer we examine it. Rapum, usually written in English as Rephaim, The word appears in ritual texts and literary passages from Ugarit, sometimes in contexts that seem to involve the dead, sometimes kings, sometimes ancient ancestors, and sometimes beings who appear to belong to a divine or semi-divine world below the surface of ordinary human life. They are difficult to pin down, and that difficulty is not a failure of modern scholarship. It is part of what makes these tablets so valuable. They preserve a religious world that did not divide reality into the neat categories we often expect. Living people on one side, dead people on another, gods in a separate realm above them all. For the people of Ugarit, those boundaries could blur. The Rephim may have been dead kings. They may have been revered ancestors. They may have been powerful underworld beings, a company of departed figures who had crossed into a condition beyond normal human death. Or perhaps the word could carry more than one of those meanings depending on the ritual, the speaker, and the moment. Picture a royal ceremony in the ancient city. The king is alive. He rules in the visible world. He receives food, tribute, and loyalty. But behind him stands a longer line. Fathers, grandfathers, founders, rulers, whose bodies are gone but whose authority has not entirely disappeared. Their names may still carry weight. Their favor may still matter. Their memory may be part of what makes the present king legitimate. In that setting, the dead are not simply absent. They are still part of the kingdom. Some Ugaritic ritual texts seem to call upon the Rephim as a group. They are invited, honored, perhaps offered food and drink. In one especially important set of texts, they are associated with a figure or group called Didanu. Scholars have often connected this name with a royal ancestral line, though the exact relationship remains debated. The text can sound almost like an ancient guest list. Come Rephim, come ancestral powers, come figures of the old royal house. Join the feast. That might sound eerie to us. A banquet for the dead, a royal meal shared across the boundary of death. But in the ancient Near East, feeding and honoring ancestors was not necessarily understood as dark magic or ghost worship in the modern horror movie sense. It could be an act of memory, an act of loyalty, an act of political continuity. The living king did not stand alone. He stood at the end of a chain, reaching backward into sacred time. And this is where the Rephaim become more than a footnote in an old myth. They show us that kingship itself could be imagined as larger than one human lifetime. A king died, his body was buried, but his role might continue in another form. Not as an ordinary citizen of the underworld, and not necessarily as a god equal to Baal or El, but as a powerful dead ancestor, a royal presence who remained connected to the land and dynasty. This does not mean every deceased person became a Rephaim. The evidence does not let us say that, and it does not mean the Rephim were simply ghosts. That English word brings along too many modern assumptions: transparent figures in abandoned houses, angry spirits demanding revenge, the dead trapped in one place. The Ugaritic material points towards something more formal and more collective. The Rephim appear as a recognized class or assembly. They can be summoned in ritual language. They are connected with ancient authority. And in some passages, they seem to move or gather with a dignity that suggests they are not helpless shades. But translating the word remains difficult. The consonants RP are clear enough on the tablets. The meaning is not. Ancient languages often preserve words that are bigger than any single dictionary definition. A term can gather meanings over centuries. It can refer to an old institution, a religious role, a mythic people, or a category of beings whose exact nature everyone in that culture understood without needing it explained. We are hearing only fragments of that conversation, and the fragments come from a city destroyed more than 3,000 years ago. Still, there are clues. The Rephim are often associated with the realm of the dead, with royal ancestors, and with a kind of enduring power. That overlap makes sense in the world of Ugarit. A dead king was not merely an individual who had stopped breathing. He had been the center of a household and army, a temple network, and a political order. His death did not erase the force of his name. The royal dead could become almost mythic, and the mythic past could become almost divine. This is one reason ancient religions can seem so crowded to modern readers. There are high gods like El, active gods like Baal and Anat, hostile powers like Mot and Yam, lesser divine beings, ancestral kings, honored dead spirits linked to places, families, mountains, and graves. The universe is layered, not empty space with a few supernatural characters dropped into it, a living hierarchy full of presences. Later biblical texts use related Hebrew terms, often translated as Rephim. There the word can refer to the dead in the underworld, shadowy departed beings who no longer possess the strength of the living. In other passages, Rephaim seem to be remembered as ancient giant peoples associated with legendary warriors and old territories east of the Jordan. That is a fascinating connection, but it is not a simple one. The Hebrew Bible was written and edited across many centuries in changing political and religious worlds. A word related to Ugaritic art poem may preserve an older shared Northwest Semitic heritage, but shared vocabulary does not prove that every later use means exactly what it meant at Ugarit. Words travel, meanings change. Old religious ideas can be remembered, reworked, argued against, or turned into stories about a vanished age. So when biblical texts speak of Rephaim as dead shades that may echo the Ugaritic sense of powerful departed beings, when they speak of giant Rephaim that may preserve another strand of ancient memory, perhaps one in which the word had become attached to legendary ancient peoples, but we should resist the urge to force all those meanings into one answer. The Rephaim of Ugarit are not clearly demons, they are not clearly rebellious angels, they are not the watchers from the Book of Enoch. Those associations come later, often through centuries of interpretation in which ancient words were gathered into new systems of belief. The Ugaritic tablets do not give us a full story of fallen heavenly beings producing monstrous offspring. They give us something older and in its own way quieter. A world where the royal dead could still be honored. A world where ancestors could stand near the gods. A world where death did not end significance. And once you begin to see that shadowed world behind the tablets, another question starts to rise. If ancient people could imagine the dead as powerful, enduring, and close to the divine, what happened when later writers began telling stories about heavenly beings who crossed forbidden boundaries into the human world? The answer begins with a reminder that can sound almost obvious, but is easy to forget. Ugarit and ancient Israel did not exist in separate universes. They were part of the same larger Northwest Semitic world. Their languages were related. Their scribes used many of the same basic words for gods, mountains, seas, death, kingship, sacrifice, and the heavens. Their people lived among overlapping trade routes, political rivalries, migrations, and inherited stories. So when the Eucharistic tablets sometimes sound familiar to readers of the Hebrew Bible, that is not necessarily surprising. It is what we should expect. Ugaritic is not Hebrew. The tablets are not early drafts of biblical books. The religion of Ugarit was not biblical religion before the Bible, but the languages are close cousins, and cousins often preserve old family words. The Ugaritic high god is El. In Hebrew, El is also a basic word for God, and El appears in many biblical names: Israel, Samuel, Bethel. The God of Israel is sometimes called Elon, God Most High, or El Shaddai. These titles belong to a world where divine names and titles carried long histories. At Ugarit, El is the aged fatherly figure of the divine assembly. He presides, judges, grants authority, and stands at the head of the gods. In parts of the Hebrew Bible, we also find a heavenly council. Psalm 82 opens with God standing in the divine assembly, judging among the Elohim, the gods or divine beings. Psalm 89 speaks of the council of holy ones, beings in the skies who surround the Lord. The book of Job imagines the sons of God presenting themselves before the Lord. These scenes do not mean the biblical writers simply accepted the Ugaritic pantheon unchanged. They do show that Israelite writers could imagine heaven as a royal court, not empty space, not a lonely throne floating in silence, a court, a council, a divine assembly beneath the authority of the highest God. And that image was old, a Ugarit. The gods gather before El. Decisions are made, messages are carried, authority is granted. Baal must seek permission for his palace. Conflicts in heaven shape the world below. In the Bible, the council remains, but its meaning shifts. The God of Israel is not one powerful member among competing gods. He is the ruler whose authority cannot finally be challenged. The heavenly beings serve him. They carry out his commands. Even when they appear strange, dangerous, or mysterious, they do not stand as true rivals. The old language is still there, but the theological center has changed. And then there is Baal, the storm lord, the rider of the clouds. In the Baal cycle, Baal is repeatedly associated with thunder, rain, fertile fields, and the clouds that cross the sky. His power is heard in the storm. His voice shakes the earth. His arrival can mean life for fields that have waited through the dry season. The Hebrew Bible uses storm imagery too. The Lord rides upon the clouds. He comes in thunder. He controls rain, wind, sea, and lightning. Psalm 68 calls him the one who rides through the deserts. Psalm 104 describes him as making the clouds his chariot. That language is especially striking because clouder riding was one of Baal's great claims. So what are we hearing in these biblical passages? Possibly shared poetic inheritance. Possibly familiar regional language given new meaning, and in some cases perhaps something sharper than inheritance. PMIC. A polemic is an argument. A writer takes an idea people already know and turns it against a rival. If Baal is famous as the rider of the clouds, then calling the God of Israel the true rider of the clouds makes a claim without needing to name Baal directly. The storm does not belong to Baal. The rain does not belong to Baal. The sky does not belong to Baal. The biblical writers can take the most impressive symbols of the old storm god and place them in the hands of their own god. It is not copying, it is competition through poetry. The same pattern appears with the sea. In Ugaritic myth, Yam, sea is not merely water. He is a dangerous divine power. He represents the untamed flood, the force that threatens order, the chaos that must be restrained. Baal's struggle against Yam is a cosmic battle. If Yam wins, the world is placed under the rule of the sea. Biblical poetry often speaks of the sea in similar terms. The waters roar. The deep is dangerous. The sea can stand for chaos, threat, and forces beyond human control. But again, the biblical story changes the meaning. The Lord does not struggle because the sea is his equal. He rebukes it. He sets its boundaries. He crushes sea monsters in poetic passages like Psalm 74 and Isaiah 27. The imagery may preserve the memory of older battles, but the result is different. The God of Israel does not win his throne by defeating chaos. He already rules. Even the sea has limits, because he says so. Then there is Mot, death at Ugarit. Mot speaks. He hungers. He devours Ba. He rules the dry hidden realm beneath the world of life. Death is not just an event, it is a power with a mouth. Hebrew biblical poetry can speak of death and Sheol in similarly vivid ways. Death has cords, Sheol opens its jaws, the pit waits below. These are not always literal descriptions of a god named Death. They are poetic ways of giving shape to the terror of dying, but they belong to the same ancient landscape of imagination. Sea below, mountain above, the divine court in the heavens, death in the depths, and between them the human world, fragile and temporary. Mountains matter too. Baal's palace rises on Mount Zaphon, the sacred northern mountain. It is a place of divine rule, storm clouds, and heavenly authority. Biblical texts know the language of the divine mountain as well. Zion becomes the mountain of the Lord. Isaiah can even mock the king of Babylon for dreaming of sitting on the Mount of Assembly in the far north. Language that may echo older ideas connected with Zaphon. Once again, the old map remains visible, but the names and loyalties are transformed. This is the careful way to read the parallels. Not Uga proves that the Bible copied a Canaanite myth, and not the Bible has nothing to do with the world around it. The truth is more interesting. Biblical writers inherited a vocabulary full of ancient gods, old cosmic battles, sacred mountains, hostile seas, and shadowed underworld powers. Sometimes they preserved those images. Sometimes they adapted them. Sometimes they used them to argue that the God of Israel stood above every rival claim. And as these old divine councils continue to change, another kind of heavenly being would begin to step forward. Not Baal, not El, not the royal dead, but watchers, sons of God, angels, beings who stood near the throne of heaven and who in later stories would do something they were never meant to do. The next step takes us out of Bronze Age Ugarit and into a much later Jewish world, a world still full of heavenly courts, dangerous powers, sacred mountains, and old memories of beings who came down from above. This is the world of one Enoch. First Enoch is not one book written at one moment by one author. It is a collection of Jewish writings assembled over time with different sections coming from different periods and communities. Much of it survives most fully in Ethiopic, the classical language of Ethiopia, which is why the work is often called the Ethiopic Book of Enoch. Fragments in Aramaic were also found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, showing that parts of it circulated in Jewish circles long before the surviving Ethiopic manuscripts were copied. And its most famous section is called the Book of the Watchers. The Watchers are heavenly beings. They are not human priests staring at the night sky. They are not simply gods in the old Ugaritic sense. They are members of the heavenly world, figures who watch, who stand near the order of heaven, who should remain where they belong, but they do not. The story begins with a brief and mysterious passage from Genesis. Genesis says that the sons of God saw that human women were beautiful, took wives, and produced mighty offspring known as the Nephilim. The biblical passage is only a few lines long. It does not explain who these sons of God were. It does not give their names. It does not describe their punishment in detail. The Book of the Watchers takes that tiny opening and turns it into an enormous cosmic disaster. Picture this. The earth below is full of human beings living ordinary lives beneath a sky they barely understand. Above them is the ordered world of heaven, populated by messengers and servants of the Most High. There is supposed to be a boundary between the two. Then a group of watchers crosses it. Their leader is usually called Semihazer. In the story, he descends with a company of 200 watchers onto Mount Hermon, the high mountain range on the northern edge of the land of Israel. They make an oath together, not a casual decision, not one being making a mistake and the others following later. An oath. They bind themselves to a shared act of rebellion. They will take human women as wives. They will father children, and no one among them will be able to retreat without betraying the others. This is one reason the Watcher's story feels different from the battles of Baal and Yam. Baal fights for kingship. Yam threatens cosmic order. Mo represents the devouring certainty of death. But the Watchers do not launch a war to seize heaven's throne. Their rebellion is a violation of boundaries. Heavenly beings enter the human world. They take what is not theirs to take, and then they give humanity knowledge it was not ready to carry. Another Watcher, Asael, sometimes known as Azel in related traditions, becomes especially important here. Asael teaches human beings how to make swords, knives, shields, breastplates, and weapons of war. He reveals the working of metals. He teaches the crafting of ornaments, cosmetics, dyes, and mirrors. Other Watchers teach astrology, signs in the sky, the movements of the moon, enchantments, root cutting, and secret forms of knowledge. Now, the story is not saying that every craft is evil. Ancient Jewish people used tools, understood seasons, wore jewelry, and worked with metal. The point is more unsettling than that. Knowledge has arrived out of order. It has been given by rebels. The Watchers bring powers that magnify human desire, violence, pride, and manipulation. Weapons become instruments of bloodshed. Beauty entangled with seduction and status. Heavenly signs become material for forbidden prediction. What should have remained hidden or what should have been learned within proper limits is poured into the world all at once. And then come the children. The unions between Watchers and human women produce giants. In later imagination, these are often connected with the Nephilim, though the traditions are complicated and not every ancient text uses the terms in exactly the same way. In 1 Enoch, The giants are enormous, hungry, and destructive. They consume the labor of humanity. Then, when human food is no longer enough, they turn against humans themselves. The earth fills with violence. It is a story of cosmic rebellion becoming social collapse. A decision made on a mountain reaches every village, every field, every household. The cries of the ruined world rise toward heaven, and heaven hears. 4 great heavenly messengers appear in the narrative: Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel. They see the bloodshed. They see the corruption spreading across the earth. They bring the case before God. The response is judgment. Raphael is commanded to bind Asael and cast him into a place of darkness. Gabriel is sent against the violent giants. Michael is told to bind Haza and the other watchers, imprisoning them until the final judgment. The rebellious beings who crossed heaven's boundary are forced into confinement beneath the earth. Even the giants do not escape the consequences. Their bodies are destroyed, but their spirits, the story says, remain wandering on earth as harmful spirits. This idea would become deeply influential in later Jewish and Christian traditions about demons. So, the Book of the Watchers gives suffering a vast backstory. Human violence is human, but it has also been intensified by a rebellion from above. Still, we need to keep the timeline clear. The Book of the Watchers belongs to the Second Temple Jewish world, not to Bronze Age Ugarit. Most scholars place its composition somewhere in the centuries before the time of Jesus, though its traditions may have developed over a longer period. It stands much closer to the world of biblical interpretation, Persian and Hellenistic empires, apocalyptic expectation, angels, demons, judgment, and the coming restoration of creation. The Watchers are not characters in the Ugaritic Baal cycle. Their names do not appear on the tablets from Ras Shamra. Semihazer is not Baal, Asel is not Mot. There is no Ugaritic text that tells the Watcher's story in its Enoic form, but that does not end the question, because both worlds imagine heaven as populated. Both know divine assemblies, both know dangerous powers crossing the boundaries of the cosmos, and both place human life beneath conflicts that begin far above the earth. The similarities are real. The direct line between them is much harder to prove. So, does Ugarit preserve an earlier version of the Watcher's story? It is a tempting idea. You have ancient tablets from a Canaanite city on the Syrian coast. You have a much later Jewish story about heavenly beings descending to earth, bringing dangerous knowledge and causing catastrophe. Both worlds contain divine counsels. Both imagine a sky crowded with powers. Both know mountains where heaven and earth seem to touch. Both describe disorder as something larger than one bad king, one failed harvest, or one human crime. Put all that together, and it can feel as if the answer must be yes. Maybe the Watchers were already there in Ugarit, only under older names. Maybe Baal, El, Em, Yam, or the lesser members of the Divine Assembly are fragments of an ancient story that later became Enoch. But this is where the evidence asks us to slow down, because resemblance is not the same thing as identity. Ugarit absolutely gives us a world that makes later stories of heavenly beings easier to understand. Its tablets show a divine assembly, a council gathered around El, the aged high god. They show gods with different roles, rivalries, territories, and powers. They show the cosmos as a place where the sea can rise against order, death can swallow even the storm god, and kingship in heaven is something that can be challenged, lost, and restored. That is a dramatic universe. It is not a universe in which heaven is empty and silent with one distant god ruling over a purely human world below. It is a crowded cosmos, a political cosmos, a cosmos where decisions made above have consequences below. And that broad imagination does have something in common with the Book of the Watchers. In both, the world above is organized. There are ranks, there are councils, there are beings who belong in heaven, and beings who threaten the balance of creation. Disorder is not merely random, it has personalities, it has agency. It comes from powers acting beyond the human village, beyond the city wall, beyond the horizon. But then the stories begin moving in very different directions. The Baal cycle is mainly concerned with divine kingship and the stability of the natural world. Can Baal, the storm god, defeat Yam, the dangerous sea? Can he establish his palace on the holy mountain? Can life-giving rain continue when Mot, the power of death and drought, claims him? Its great tensions are seasonal, royal, and cosmic. Baal is not a fallen angel. He does not descend because he desires human women. He does not teach forbidden knots to humanity. He does not father giants. And when he confronts enemies, the problem is not that a heavenly being has crossed a moral boundary between heaven and earth. The problem is who will rule. Yam represents an untamed force that threatens the ordered world. Mot represents death, dryness, hunger, and the grave. Baal struggles against them because the world needs rain, fertility, and a stable divine order. The story can be violent, strange, and full of divine threats. But it is not the Enochic story of angelic rebellion corrupting human society. The Watcher story has a different center of gravity. Its deepest concern is not whether a storm god will win a palace. It is why violence has overwhelmed the earth. Why do humans make weapons? Why does secret knowledge become destructive? Why do boundaries collapse? Why are giants devouring the world for one Enoch? The answer involves moral transgression. The Watchers were supposed to remain in heaven. They came down. They took human wives. They revealed knowledge in the wrong way at the wrong time, through the wrong agents. Their punishment is not simply defeat in a contest for kingship. It is imprisonment and judgment that is a very different kind of cosmic conflict. In Ugarit, divine beings can be dangerous, selfish, violent, and unpredictable. But the tablets do not present a group of heavenly servants who rebel against the high god by marrying mortal women. They do not tell of 200 beings swearing an oath on Mount Hermon. They do not name Semihaza or Asael. They do not describe giants born from heavenly and human unions. And they do not explain the origin of evil spirits as the wandering remains of dead giants. Those are not small missing details. They are the plot, and the historical distance matters too. Ugarit was destroyed around the beginning of the 12th century BCE during the upheavals that ended the Late Bronze Age. Its tablets were buried for roughly 3,000 years before modern excavators found them. The surviving portions of 1 Enoch are much later. The Book of the Watchers is generally placed in the centuries before the Common Era in the Second Temple period. Even if some of its ideas preserve older traditions, we are still looking across many centuries of change. Kingdoms rose and fell, languages shifted. Israelite religion developed in conversation with its Canaanite inheritance, with Mesopotamian traditions, and later with Persian and Greek worlds. That is not a simple line from one tablet to one scroll. It is more like a river system. Old streams may feed later channels. Themes may survive. Images may be remembered, transformed, argued over, and given new meanings. A divine council in one age can become a heavenly court in another. A mountain associated with gods can become the setting for an angelic oath. Old ideas about dangerous powers can be reshaped into a story about rebellion. Forbidden knowledge, judgment, and the corruption of the human world. Possible influence is not impossible. The ancient Levant was never sealed into separate boxes. Stories traveled with merchants, scribes, soldiers, marriages, exiles, and priests. People heard old names and retold old fears. They borrowed images without preserving whole stories unchanged. But direct descent is harder to demonstrate. To say that the Ugaritic tablets are the original Watcher's story would require evidence we simply do not have. We would need clearer shared characters, a recognizable sequence of events or texts connecting the traditions across time. Instead, what we have are broad family resemblances within the mythic world of the ancient Near East. And honestly, that may be more interesting, because it means the Watchers did not need to be copied from one lost Ugaritic tablet in order to feel ancient. They emerged from a region where people had long imagined heaven as populated, powerful, and dangerous. A region where the sea could be an enemy, death could speak, mountains could be divine meeting places, and human life could be shaped by struggles occurring far above the fields. The real mystery is not whether Ugarit gives us a secret exact script for 1 Enoch. It is how old cosmic ideas kept changing century after century until heavenly beings became watchers. Rebellion became a crime against creation, and the violence of the earth was traced back to an oath made on a mountain. And once you start looking for that oath on the mountain, something else begins to appear. Not one single watcher story hiding behind every ancient myth. Not one lost original that all later traditions copied word for word. What appears instead is a shared map, a way of imagining the universe that was familiar across the ancient Near East for thousands of years. The map had heights and depths. It had dangerous borders. It had powers that belonged in one place but sometimes crossed into another. Above was heaven, the realm of the high God, the stars, and the divine assembly. Below was the inhabited earth, with its cities, fields, rivers, kings, families, and graves. Beyond the ordered land was the sea, vast and unstable, a force that could bring trade and life, but also storms, floods, and terror. Beneath the earth was the underworld, the house of death, silence, shadows, ancestors, and powers that did not easily return. And between all these regions stood the mountain. Mountains mattered because they seemed to rise out of the human world toward the sky. Clouds gathered around their peaks. Storms broke over them. Snow remained on them when lower ground was dry. From a village below, a mountain could look like a staircase leading toward heaven. At Ugarit, Baal's palace stands on Mount Zion, a holy mountain associated with storm, kingship, and divine presence. In the Book of the Watchers, the rebellious angels descend and swear their oath on Mount Hermon. These are not necessarily the same mountain in the same story, but they belong to the same kind of ancient geography. Mountains were places where the ordinary boundaries of the world could feel thin. Heaven above, earth below, the deep beneath, the mountain between. Once you have that map, you can tell many different kinds of stories on it. You can tell a story about the sea rising against the gods. That is close to what happens with Yam in the Baal cycle. Yam is not simply salt water. He is the threatening force of the sea made personal, a power that demands authority and challenges the order of the divine world. You can tell a story about death swallowing life. That is what Mo does. He is not merely a dead human soul, and not just a grim reaper waiting beside a grave. He is death as a hungry speaking power. Dryness, famine, the grave, the end of rain. You can tell a story about a younger god winning authority from older powers. Across the ancient Near East, myths sometimes imagine divine rule is contested. A storm god rises, a sea monster is defeated. A new king establishes a palace. Order is not assumed, it has to be defended. And then you can tell a different story. A story in which beings from heaven do not challenge the sea or fight for a throne. They break a boundary. They come down to earth. They mix the worlds in a forbidden way. They teach knowledge that human beings were not meant to have. That is the direction taken by the Watchers' tradition. These stories can share scenery without sharing the same plot. That distinction is important. A divine succession myth asks, who rules the cosmos? A chaos combat myth asks, can order survive the threat of sea, serpent, drought, or death? The Watcher's story asks something more like this. Why has human society become so violent, corrupt, and dangerous? Who is responsible when knowledge becomes a weapon? Those are related questions, but they are not identical questions. In the Yuga world, disorder often comes from cosmic rivals. Yam presses against the boundaries of the ordered world. Mot threatens the cycle of life. Baal's victories and defeats matter because rain matters. Crops matter. Kingship matters. If the storm god loses, the land itself may suffer. In 1 Enoch, disorder has a sharper moral edge. The Watchers are not merely rival divine powers doing what powerful beings do. They have violated their proper station. They have left heaven. Their knowledge helps turn the human world toward bloodshed, luxury, warfare, and exploitation. The crisis is cosmic, yes, but it is also ethical. That may tell us something about the world in which later Jewish writers were thinking. They inherited old images, the heavenly court, the holy mountain, the abyss, the rebellious power, the stars moving through the sky in ordered courses. But they could use those images to ask newer and more urgent questions. Why do the wicked seem to prosper? Why is violence everywhere? Why does the world feel as though its proper order has been damaged? If God rules heaven, why are there still destructive forces at work on earth? The answer offered by the Watcher's story is dramatic. Evil is not only a human mistake, it has a heavenly history. Something went wrong above before its consequences spread below. And this is where fallen stars enter the picture. In ancient poetry and prophecy, stars could be more than distant lights. They could represent gods, kings, heavenly beings, or members of the divine host. Their regular movement across the sky made them symbols of order. They rose when they were supposed to rise. They crossed their appointed paths. They disappeared and returned. So a star falling from heaven was not always just astronomy. It could be a picture of humiliation, a proud king cast down, a celestial being losing its place, a power once high brought low. Later Jewish and Christian traditions would develop this image in many directions, sometimes connecting fallen stars with rebellious angels. But the image itself is broader and older than any one interpretation. A falling star means that the map has been disturbed. Something that belonged above has come down. But even here we have to be careful. A star in one text does not automatically mean an angel in another. A mountain in one story does not automatically preserve a memory of Hermon. A sea monster is not necessarily a fallen watcher in disguise. Ancient writers reused powerful images because those images were useful. They could be adapted to new languages, new empires, new fears, and new religious arguments. Think of the ancient Near East, less like a library containing one original story, and more like a night sky seen from many cities. The same stars are visible, but every community draws different lines between them. One group sees a divine king, another sees a monster, another sees an angelic being, another sees a warning about human pride. The lights may be shared. The constellations are not. That is why continuity and transformation have to be held together. There is continuity because later writers did not invent their cosmic imagination from nothing. They lived in a world shaped by older languages of heaven and earth, holy mountains and chaotic seas, divine councils and hostile depths. Ugarit helps us recover part of that older world with unusual clarity. But there is transformation because the Book of the Watchers does something distinct with those materials. It turns cosmic geography into a moral drama. It turns descent from heaven into transgression. It turns ancient fears about disorder into an explanation for violence, forbidden knowledge, and coming judgment. The old map remained, but the travelers changed. And that brings us to the edge of what the tablets can actually tell us. The clay tablets from Ugarit are extraordinary. They give us names that had once been almost silent. El, the old fatherly god. Asher linked with the divine household. Baal, the storm lord whose reign could mean life for the fields. Anat, fierce and active. Yam, the sea. Mot, death. They preserve poems about conflict, kingship, drought, rain, feasting, mourning, and return. They also preserve rituals, offerings for gods, lists of sacrifices, calendars, prayers, administrative records, letters written by people who were not trying to explain the deepest secrets of the universe, but who still had grain to count, livestock to record, shipments to receive, and obligations to fulfill. This matters because it keeps Ugarit real. The gods of the poems were not only characters in stories, they belonged to a lived religious world. People brought offerings, scribes copied texts, kings ruled from nearby palaces, farmers watched the sky and waited for rain. Merchants sailed the coast, and somewhere within that world, someone pressed a stylus into wet clay and preserved the struggle between Ba, Yam, and Mot. That much is solid ground. We can say that Ugaritic texts describe a divine assembly. We can say that Baal struggles for authority. We can say that hostile powers are imagined through the sea, death, drought, and the wild edges of the cosmos. We can say that Mount Zephon mattered as a divine mountain. We can say that the language and imagery of this world help modern readers understand the broader cultural atmosphere from which later biblical and Jewish traditions emerged. But solid ground does not mean complete ground. Many tablets are broken. Sometimes a text survives in several fragments found years apart, with edges that fit together like pieces of a puzzle. Sometimes the middle of a line is missing. Sometimes the beginning of an entire episode has vanished. A God speaks, but we do not know exactly who was being addressed. A battle seems to be starting, but the tablet breaks before the outcome. A familiar word appears in an unfamiliar grammar, and scholars have to decide whether it means one thing, another thing, or something we no longer understand at all. Ugaritic was written in an alphabetic ununiform script, and it is closely related to other Northwest Semitic languages that gives scholars important clues. Hebrew, Aramaic, Phoenician, Arabic, and other languages can sometimes illuminate a difficult word. But a clue is not a certainty. Languages shift. Words change meaning. Poets use rare expressions on purpose. And ancient scribes, just like modern writers, could be playful, obscure, formal, repetitive, or frustratingly brief. So when you read a smooth modern translation of an Ugaritic poem, it helps to remember what may lie beneath it. Brackets, question marks, restored letters, possible readings, tiny decisions made by translators trying to hear a voice from more than 3,000 years ago. That is not a weakness in the study of Ugarit. It is part of the wonder of it. We are not opening a perfectly preserved book with a title page and an author's name. We are listening through cracks in clay, and the archive itself is incomplete in another way. Ras Shamra was a city, not a single religious library. What survived was shaped by accident. Which rooms burned, which shelves collapsed, which tablets were baked hard by fire instead of dissolving back into mud, which text happened to be copied shortly before the city was destroyed around the beginning of the 12th century BCE. There may have been stories we never found, rituals no one wrote down, local traditions that lived only in speech, arguments between priests, families, and scribes that disappeared with the people who made them. Silence in the archive is not proof that something never existed, but neither is a gap in the archive permission to fill it with whatever story we would most like to find. This is where archaeology and speculation have to be separated carefully. Archaeology gives us tablets, buildings, objects, inscriptions, and their physical context. Philology gives us careful translations and comparisons between languages. History gives us trade routes, political pressures, neighboring kingdoms, and the slow movement of ideas across generations. Then reconstruction begins. Reconstruction is necessary. Every historian does it. We connect fragments. We ask what a damaged line may have meant. We compare Baal's battle with other storm god myths. We notice echoes between Ugaritic language and biblical poetry. We consider whether old motifs survived, changed, and traveled. But reconstructions are not the same thing as evidence. And popular speculation often takes one more step. It sees a divine council and declares that Ugarit explains every angel in the Bible. It sees a mountain and declares that it must be Mount Hermon. It sees rebellious powers in heaven and declares that the Watcher story has been discovered, whole and complete, hidden in a Bronze Age tablet. That is more exciting than the evidence allows. The Ugaritic tablets do not tell the story of the Watchers as we find it in 1 Enoch. They do not describe a band of angels descending to marry human women, teaching forbidden arts, fathering giants, and awaiting final judgment. Those are features of a later and distinctive Jewish tradition. What Ugarit gives us is something both less dramatic and, in a way, more valuable. It gives us an older world of images, a world where heaven had a court, where gods had ranks, rivalries, and territories, where the sea could rise as an enemy, where death could speak, where a mountain could hold the palace of a storm god, where the boundary between order and chaos had to be defended again and again. Later writers could inherit parts of that world without copying its stories. They could take the old language of divine beings and give it a sharper moral meaning. They could take the mountain and make it the place of an oath. They could take the heavenly assembly and imagine rebellion within it. They could take chaos from the sea and the underworld, then locate the source of corruption in beings who crossed from heaven into the human world. That is the cautious possibility. Not a direct line from one Ugaritic tablet to the Book of Enoch, not a secret original version waiting beneath the text, but inherited motifs, shared cultural memory, and old cosmic patterns traveling through centuries of retelling. And perhaps that is why wars in heaven remain so compelling. They turn invisible fears into a story, the storm that ruins a harvest, the sea that takes a ship, death that comes too early, violence that seems larger than any one person, the sense that the world is ordered but that order is fragile. A war above the clouds gives those fears a shape. It says the darkness is not random, it has a name, it can be resisted, it may even be defeated, though never without cost. So we return at last to the scribes of Ugarit, not prophets of a future book, not secret keepers of every later mystery, just human beings in an ancient coastal city, working carefully in rooms filled with clay, ink, accounts, hymns, offerings, and stories of gods. They preserved a world that they understood in their own way, and through the broken tablets they left behind, we can still glimpse it, only partly, but enough to know that the old heavens were crowded, the old earth was uncertain, and the stories people told between them were powerful enough to survive, long after the city itself had fallen silent, and that may be the longest afterlife of all. Ugarit did not survive as an empire. Its palace fell, its harbor quieted, its scribes stopped writing. For more than 3,000 years, the city rested beneath the soil of Ras Shamra, while the names of its gods survived only in scattered echoes, distorted memories, and languages that had changed beyond recognition. Then the tablets came back, and with them came a recovered world. Before Ugarit, scholars knew that the ancient Levant had been home to many peoples, many local gods, and many old traditions. But the tablets gave that world a voice, not a vague background behind the Bible or Greek mythology, but a living religious landscape of its own. A world with its own poetry, its own rituals, its own royal archives, and its own terrifying imagination. In that imagination, Baal struggled against Yam, the sea that threatened order with its untamed force. Then Baal faced Mot, death itself, the power of drought, decay, hunger, and the grave. He won, he fell, he returned. And above these struggles stood the divine council, a heavenly assembly, where authority was recognized, contested, granted, and sometimes endangered. That pattern did not vanish when Ugarit vanished. It changed over centuries. Old images moved from one culture to another. Storm gods became memories. Divine assemblies became councils of heavenly beings. Ancient chaos monsters appeared in new poems. Mountains, seas, stars, underworlds, rebellious powers, and the fragile boundary between heaven and earth all continued to matter. And eventually in Jewish writings such as the Book of Enoch, we find another vision of a crowded heaven, a vision of watchers who cross a forbidden boundary, of knowledge that becomes dangerous, of giants, judgment, and cosmic disorder. Is that the old Ugarit story preserved intact? Probably not. But is it possible that both traditions draw upon some of the same deep patterns of the ancient Near East? A world where heaven had ranks and laws, where divine beings could threaten order, where mountains joined earth to the sky, and where evil could be imagined as a breach in the structure of creation? Yes, that is a reasonable question, and questions are sometimes more valuable than easy answers. Dismissive skepticism can make the ancient world seem empty, as if every similarity must be coincidence and every connection impossible. But overconfident comparisons can be just as misleading. They can turn a shared image into a direct borrowing, a broken tablet into a complete lost book, and an intriguing possibility into certainty. The better path is quieter. It is to let Ugarit be Ugarit, to let Enoch be Enoch, to notice the echoes without pretending they are identical voices, to follow the old patterns carefully across centuries of adaptation, translation, memory, and change. Because the real wonder is not that one ancient text secretly explains everything. The wonder is that human beings kept returning to the same great questions. Who rules the storm? What waits beyond death? Why does order feel so fragile? And what happens when powers from above cross into the human world? For centuries, the answers lay silent in darkness, pressed into clay tablets beneath a ruined city. Then someone uncovered them. Someone learned the signs. Someone listened. And Baal spoke again. Yam rose again. Mot opened his mouth once more. The ancient council assembled again, not inside a palace on Mount Zaphon, but within the imagination of people trying to understand a world long gone. If you enjoyed this journey through the Ugaritic tablets, gently like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us once again where you are listening from. It is always fascinating to think of these ancient stories, traveling from a Bronze Age city along the Syrian coast to listeners scattered across the world today. And if you would like to support the channel in the most helpful way, you can listen on Spotify using the link in the description. For now, let these tablets become quiet again. Clay resting in darkness, fragmented lines, ancient names waiting patiently, just as they waited for thousands of years, until someone is ready to open their story and read them once more.